What's up guys, my name is Cairo and welcome to another Unreal Engine tutorial. Today we are going to be talking about how to set up a quick, easy and efficient materials workflow inside the Unreal Engine. Now, as you can see from this very simple scene that I've set up over here, it probably took me about 10 minutes, so it's definitely not going to win any level design awards, but in this entire scene, which as you can see is made up of various components, in this entire scene I only used 3 materials. So how I did this is by making use of the material instance inside the engine. So first of all, what we are going to do is look at the mistake that most beginners tend to make when using the engine for the first time, is that they try to use as many materials as they can in order to create a look of randomness or non-uniformity. Now, with the material instance, we can create non-uniform looks much more easily than if you were to use 10 or 20 materials inside your scene. So first of all, we're going to look at a material workflow which can be utilized but is not as quick as that of using the material instance. So if we go to this mesh I have over here, just this rubble mesh, you can see that I've already created a parent material called rubble. So if we go inside the material editor, you can see that I've set up quite a few scalars and texture samples and vectors inside this material. Now for today, we're not going to worry about how this was set up, but rather how to utilize the parameters inside this. So for example, now you can see that when I've opened up the materials editor, the preview is not yet rendered, and this is because every time you open up the material editor, it first has to compile all the shaders inside the material. So once those shaders have been compiled, then our preview will finally appear. Once our shaders have finished compiling, you can now see inside our preview window that we now have a rough idea of what the material will look like once it has been rendered. The problem with this workflow is that every time you change a value or texture or any type of parameter inside your material editor, the shaders will have to recompile and you'll have to wait all over again for this to be done. And if you're working along with the tutorial, you have noticed that this can take quite a long time, especially if you're working with quite complex materials. That is why I have introduced all these different parameters inside the parent material so that we can utilize them within the material instance. So just to further demonstrate my point, I've introduced a base color multiply vector parameter over here. So if I were to change this color to pink, and it will multiply them so that we will have a texture which is affected by the color that we choose. As you can see, once again, now that I've changed this value, the material now has to recompile the shaders. As you can see, the material has changed inside the engine, but still in our materials editor, it is still having to compile those shaders. This is obviously not as efficient as it could be, and that is why we are going to be going in depth today into the material instance. So I'm just going to close the editor without saving. Now you can see that because I didn't save that, once again has to recompile our shaders. So if we wanted each of these different rubble meshes to look slightly different, just to give the illusion of non-uniformity, just so that when players are walking throughout your game, they don't think that, oh, that this is exactly the same mesh as that one that they saw previously. If you are using a beginner's workflow, you might create identical materials for all three and then slightly tweak values inside each of those materials so that they do not look the same. But a much easier way to do that is simply to create 3 material instances for each of these rubble piles so that each can look different. So before we create instances of these materials, it is important to understand the concepts of a parent and a child within materials. So as you can see in the graphic over here, a material is considered the parent in this instance, and the instances are considered the children. Now, it is important to note that the children cannot have any characteristics that the parent does not have. So for example, if you look back to our parent material, you can see that I had a vector parameter, a tiling parameter, and a few other scalar parameters that all dealt with roughness, specularity, tessellation, and tiling. Now, if those parameters did not exist inside the material, then they would not be able to exist inside our material instance. So it's important to remind yourself that the child can only have characteristics of the parent. That is where it comes from. It is also important to note that it is not ideal to have a parent material which deals with all of your imagery inside your scene. For example, the mistake that some people tend to make is they might have a parent material which has texture parameters, so any texture can be inserted inside to change it. That is how I have done this kind of blending over here using these different texture parameters. So you can see that these can be changed on the fly in real time. So what you want to make sure is that perhaps you have a material for your environments, a material for your meshes, a material for your characters, and so on. So now we are going to go into making a material instance for each of our 3 rubble meshes to better clarify how this works. So if I go into my content editor here and click on my rubble material, I just right click and say create material instance, and we are going to name this 1 because we're going to have one for each of our meshes here. So I'm just going to go ahead and create another 2. You can also do this by duplicating the instance itself. It doesn't make much of a difference. So I'm just going to apply our instances to our different rubble meshes. That should be 3. So now I'm going to demonstrate how in real time you can change many of the values that you would have had to wait for your shaders to compile to do previously if you were just using a parent material. So on this mesh, I'm going to open up our material instance. And now you can see that all the parameters I had inside my parent material are showing up here as they should. So now I'm just going to activate all of these by just simply checking them. We're going to go over the static switch parameter in just a bit, but for now, let me show you how these instances can quickly change the look and feel of your material a lot quicker than editing inside your materials editor. So now, if I were to change the UV tiling over the material, you can see that as soon as I click that, it instantly changed in-game. Now, because this is a mesh with a specific texture, you might not want to tile it, but tiling and that parameter can be specifically useful if you have seamless textures, which you might be using for your landscape or bricks and things like that. For example, this texture over here, this brick texture, and this paving texture are all seamless so that they can tile however you want. However, if we look at this base color multiplier, for example, I might want to make this a bit darker. You can see how it changes the instant I click whatever value I need. So this is a very useful trick just for perhaps changing the brightness and contrast of your textures, just to create a sense of non-uniformity inside your meshes. Then I've also added parameters for roughness and specular values. We actually have a roughness texture inside our parent material, so this is just a multiplier, whereas we do not have a specular texture, so this is just a simple constant parameter. So if I set this to a very low roughness, you can see that inside the preview over here and inside our engine, straight away our material has become more specular, and without the need to have all our shaders compile. If I were to change the intensity of my normal map, it's not going to be very clear here because we have very low roughness, but that is also something that you can do to create a bit of shadowing with inside your mesh. So we can also reset these to default values. So as you can see from this, I'm just going to, let's make that this very unrealistic color, but then if I enable our parameters inside our second instance over here, you can see that this is obviously much quicker and more efficient than having to change your materials inside the editor. With just a few clicks, you have changed many of the values for your mesh, and it now looks completely different to each other. Now what we're going to go over quickly is the static switch option. So I'm just going to close these. When you update your instance, it also has to update the texture streaming data, which can take a while depending on how big your textures are, especially if you're working in 4K or 8K or even higher. But obviously this is still going to be much quicker than updating your parent material. So we're just going to go into our parent material quickly and look at the static switch which I've introduced. So the static switch can be used for performance, or it can be used for a simple branch which you might want to use to enable different options. I've used it here for the tessellation multiplier over here. So a static switch parameter has a true and false branch. So I've said that if tessellation is enabled, then inside our instance we will have the tessellation multiplier. If our switch is set to false, then we will have no tessellation, just a constant of 0. Now, a static switch is different from the rest of the material instance in that it does require you to update your shaders, because every time it takes a different branch, it has to recompile those shaders, just because it has to look at all those different options. So if you look here, you can see that as a default, our default value is set to false. So when I open up the material instance, you can see that by default the tessellation is not enabled. So as you can see, as soon as I enabled that, it had to compile the shaders again. You'll see that if I switch this off, the tessellation multiplier disappears in our scalar parameter values. And as soon as I enable it, it appears. So it's just a very nice, simple way to get a bit of variety within your meshes. But as I said, the static switch has the added cost of having to recompile your shaders, so it's just something to keep in mind. Now that we've looked at this quite simple material which I set up in 5 minutes, the rubble material, we can now just take a look at some of the parameters which are used for this other material which I made. So if this is just a collection of planes which I've used with some tessellation and some vertex painting, but as you can see, this blending of the water and the grass and the bricks is much more effective than if I had to make 5 to 10 different materials, and it would take a lot more processing power to do that. So if I open up the instance over here, you can see that we have quite a few values over here. We have some static switches over here. So the options are limitless. You can have as many parameters as you would like. You can have as few as you like. The only thing to keep in mind is that if you change the parent material, it will obviously have the shaders for all its children. So it's important to make sure that you limit the children of your parent, just so that if you change one thing inside your parent material, it doesn't have to recompile thousands and thousands of shaders. So these are just a few of the options that I included inside this material. You can also right click on a texture sample and convert it into a parameter so that your textures can be changed quite easily. For example, this plane with the water and the grass and this plane with the paving stones and the water are exactly the same material instance, but instead of the grass material over here, I just change that parameter to the paving stone parameter. Okay, the last thing we will look at is something that's not really something that you might consider important, but if you are quite methodical and like to be quite organized with your materials, what you can do is simply just change the name of your parameter groups, which are these ones that I can collapse and expand over here. All you have to do is go inside your material editor, right click on or select all the parameters that you would like to have inside a group, and then simply add them to the same group, which I will demonstrate now. As you can see in the bottom right corner over here, because I changed the tessellation multiplier over here, the shaders are still compiling. So that's something you just have to look at in terms of your meshes. They're going to take quite a while to compile because I think these meshes are actually 4K or maybe even 6K, so that explains why it takes a while to process. So anyway, quickly into the materials editor. So for example, if I would like tessellation, normal and roughness all inside the same group, I can, well, first I would have to create a group, and then I would simply just have to click on the drop down arrow over here. Let's call this texture values, I suppose. And now if you were to open up your material instance again, after you save this, you would see that they would appear inside your material instance. I think that is all for today. Hopefully you've learned a bit about the power of the material instance and using it inside your scenes just to create a bit of a different feel to each of your meshes and just to create a sense of difference inside.